Now, the final topic of this course is the relationship between individual citizens and their initiation of interaction with the agencies and agents of the state in order to influence political decisions in a way to improve benefits that come out of governmental decisions to them, either in person or to their families or to their dependents or to a larger community of people. Now, political participation, therefore, is defined as an act or an action, not just behavior, not just any expenditure of energy, but goes beyond that. That there is a pre-planned thinking behind behavior. Therefore, the individual prepares to behave in a certain way, and this mindful behavior is action. And it's the action of the individuals with the purpose of influencing political decisions. So the target of these actions are political decisions, and people try to influence these political decisions by acting in one way or another. And there are several ways of influencing political decisions. One important way, if there is an opportunity for election of representatives to the governmental offices, that is, if the political system hosts a representative form of government, whether democratic or otherwise, one way of influencing decisions is to take part in electing representatives who would be best suited to represent the kind of interests that are dear to the individual. Promote those values, promote those ways of thinking, distribute the resources in a way that the individual citizen of a political community considered as important, valuable, worthy of action. So one form of influence is through influencing the selection or recruitment of representatives of the individuals in society, if there is a way of doing that. If there are elections of representatives, then by taking part in these elections and voting in one direction or another, one can have an impact on who gets to serve as political authorities, and if those political authorities are elected to serve as incumbents in certain political positions in the way that the individual deems is important and valuable for him or her, then that kind of influence makes sense. And the individual will do whatever it is in his or her power to make sure that such a representative gets elected. But of course, it's not only taking part in voting, but also perhaps contributing money for a campaign of a certain representative. Or taking place in a meeting, demonstration, or rally for the election of a certain representative. Or, for that matter, a political party. Also, being involved in discussions with others, trying to convince individuals to vote in one direction or another. Now, all these acts are usually defined in the laws of the land, in the Constitution, and in the institutional context of elections, if there is such an institution, also electoral laws and what have you. Therefore, taking part in them constitutes taking part in those channels that are legally and legitimately accepted as channels of influence by the political regime in question. These we refer to as conventional acts of political participation, or simply conventional political participation. But not all participation occurs through conventional channels. There are such occasions that individuals are involved in acts of protest, resisting a certain decision made by authorities, showing their dislike, their complaints about a certain decision. And they take place in the form of petitioning or in the form of boycotts, strikes, rallies, demonstrations, occupation of buildings, stoppage of traffic, and what have you. And these are unconventional forms of participation. But they also come in two different forms. There are those that are involved in protest participation, that people register their dislike, their complaints, their reactions, their rejection of a certain decision or action or a policy by government. These are protest behavior and acts of protestation, if people are involved in them, by preparing to act in one way or another. Or there is, again, unconventional, in oftentimes illegal or illegitimate acts that are carried out by people to repress protests. Therefore, going after those who occupy a building to take them out of that building, throw them into the street. Or break up a rally, break up a protest demonstration, break up a strike, a non-formal, illegal wildcat strike. And there are those who are involved in such acts, which we call repressive behavior, that are also unconventional. And from time to time, these protest or repressive types of unconventional behavior can become illegal acts, illegitimate acts, and may result in a large number of people being hurt. But so far as political science is concerned, the definition does not give room for whether an act is legitimate or not, or legal or not. Whether it influences a certain decision or not is what we're after, what we care as political participation. So in the most sinister and absurd form, taking part in an assassination, for example, would also be considered as an act of political participation in the political science literature. But collecting data for such sinister and at the same time dangerous and illegal acts is very, very difficult. Therefore, we scale down our expectations and try to collect data on not just such action, but potentials for such action. So we refer to protest potential and repression potential of individual citizens in conducting surveys to understand how people get involved in such acts and participate in such forms of acts. So what I will be reporting to you in the Turkish context are, therefore, data concerning conventional and unconventional acts of political participation. First, conventional political participation. The data goes back to the 1970s, but I will only look at the data for the last and the current century, for the last decade or so, from 2002 onwards, and occasionally report on the findings of earlier periods. Now, 2002 data comes from an election survey and political participation study of 2002. 2014 results come from the ISSP's nationalism survey, to which we have attached some questions on conventional and unconventional forms of political participation. Therefore, they are not identical. As you can see from the items on the left-hand side of these two tables, we ask questions on people whether they will vote on a certain election, November the 3rd, 2002, or 30th of March, 2014. Of course, this second one is a local election, and the first one is a national election, not the same. But since local elections were carried out in this country at the same day nationally, participation in them looks as if they are also something national. Then a series of questions on whether people have ever appealed to National Assembly and whether these appeals were successful or not. If they appealed, whether successful or not, we get a yes response. If they haven't appealed, a no response. As you can see, in 2002, about 5% of the population of our survey, with about 2.3% plus or minus sampling error. So a very small percentage said that, yes, they had appealed to the deputies of the Grand National Assembly, 5% at that time. Government in Ankara, 2.6%, which is almost zero. To the provincial officers, Vali, about 3%, again, very close to zero. To the Kaymakam's office, sub-provincial governor, again, 4.5. Very low percentages, as you can see. Appeals to city mayor, that increased to about close to 10%. Whether they participated in any communal discussion to solve an issue, 16% all of a sudden, that increases. Tried to persuade a voter to vote for a certain candidate, about 28% did so, or so they argued. Whether they worked in the campaigns of a political party, about 7.5% said yes. Whether they participated in campaign rallies of political parties, about 60% said yes. Whether they paid any money as contribution for campaigns, about 2.9%. Again, very small percentage said yes. This was the picture in 2002, right before the elections, that Justice and Development Party received about 35% of the vote in 2002. And with CHP, those two political parties qualified. More than half of the voters were disenfranchised during that election because of the 10% threshold. In 2014, similar questions, but not exactly the same. Will you vote? From 93%, it dropped down to about 78% saying yes. Although the participation rate came close to about 90%, so some people either changed their minds or they lied during the interviews. Did they have an appeal? About 3.5%, even less than in 2002. Appeals to government seem to have slightly increased, but again, it's within this time our sampling error is 2.6%, within 2.6% difference, therefore slight change, but nothing important. Appeals to government in Ankara. Appeals to governor's office, now that jumped quite a bit, from 3.4% to 7.1%, doubled in this period. Sub-provincial offices, again, increased, more than doubled in that period. This is because a lot of people have been receiving financial aid from the government in the form of poverty compensation or disability payments, health care payments, etc. And for that purpose, they have to apply to these two offices. And their numbers indicate as to how many in this process seem to have increased in asking for such help. These are usually appeals made to get some kind of funding for their meager economic well-being. City mayors, again, increased from about 9% to 13%. Not a major jump, but an important jump, again, because of the same reasons. Poverty alleviation issues. Have they taken part in solution of a communal problem? It's dropped a little bit, not increased, from 2002, about 16% to 14%. The other four questions we had asked in 2002, we couldn't ask now. We didn't have the place or the cash to ask these questions in the survey, so there is no repetition of these questions. We don't know how they would have replied to them. But the overall picture showed that there was some increase in some forms of conventional participation and some drop in others, such as voting participation or public discussion-related participation. In 2002, we had also asked whether people have the habit of participating in the elections. Approximately 62% said that they took part in every general election in their lifetime that they could potentially participate. Now, we also know, especially in villages, when people get married or when they serve in the military, they could be permitted to participate in the elections even when they are legally below the minimum age for voting. In the 1970s, when I was conducting surveys in the villages, I had discovered that many who were not 21 years of age had voted in the 1977 elections. And the basic argument was that, well, I got married, I have a house, and the muhtar of the village said, well, you're grown up enough, you should vote. And then he voted. And therefore, it looked as if those who were under the age of 21, which was the legal age then in the 1970s, could vote in the villages. Although it was illegal, it was a legitimate process in the eyes of the local authorities as people took part in them under these circumstances. So these irregularities, of course, have to be considered as part of this answer. And it indicates that 62% of the people have been good citizens, that they were taking part in every election in their lifetime until 2002. 3 or more elections, about 9.4%. If you add them to this, not very good, but good citizens, we have somewhere around 3/4 of the population participating in most elections and almost every election. And the voting participation in Turkey is relatively high. Now, in the 1980s, it became mandatory to vote, but not before. But even in the 1970s, it had dropped to lower 60s participation rate, but had stayed relatively high for long periods of time. But with mandatory voting, voting participation has increased over the years. Though there are big oscillations still. On the 30th of March 2014 local elections, 89% participated. On the 10th of August 2014 presidential elections, 74% participated, 15% drop in the participation rate as of August 10th, 2014. Completely different elections. There were different issues, different thinking. On the 30th of March, many people went to the ballot box to kick the government out of power. They were not very successful, so on the 10th of August, a lot of people were disheartened and hopeless, and therefore they decided not to vote under these circumstances. Some didn't like the candidates who were running for the president, and therefore changed their voting patterns or failed to participate because of that reason. And some in the summer were out of their regular permanent addressees, because summer months are months of mobility, and some of the people were employed, for example, in picking cotton or hazelnuts or whatever out of their original place of residence. Therefore, they couldn't vote even if they wanted to vote. And some did not bother to vote. So on that basis, there are relatively high oscillations in the participation rate. As you can see, 15% is a large amount. But in the end, when you ask whether people voted in the last election, this is for 2011 election, not 2014 election. About 87% said yes, they voted. It's again a little higher than the actual percentage rate, participation rate. Some people misrecalled or lied. And it is not necessarily a big deal to lie in Turkey, as you very well know. Therefore, some people misrepresent their position, and they tend to show a public face which is in accordance with the law, although they had not actually acted that way. But the percentage is not too different from the actual participation rate. Therefore, those who have misrepresented their participation, either they forgot about it, they misrecalled, or simply lied, were not that great in number, in essence. Now, when we submit all of this to a factor analysis in 2002, these are the three different dimensions we can extract, and I name them myself, so these are my titles. They don't come out of the data, but you can put the data into a computer run of statistical package, for example, for the social sciences, SPSS, and that would extract you the kind of dimensions that exist among these various questions asked. Of this list of questions, 3 dimensions are extracted from data. Elsewhere, in some studies in North America and Europe, my colleagues were able to get 4 dimensions: discussion, public debate and discussion, participation in public debate and discussion on solution of issues turns out to be a different dimension. Mind you that this discussion is not any discussion. I'm not talking about, loose talk, where people get together and talk about politics, which is a pastime for Turkey. Most people do that in coffee shops, in tea houses, in restaurants. When people meet together, they talk about politics. They also talk about sports. If men, mostly soccer, which in recent years in Turkey sucks, but anyway, they continue speaking about it. And this is sort of loose talk. In Turkish, it's called geyik. I'm not talking about geyik here. I'm talking about providing a solution. I'm talking about like 15 mothers in a community come together and say, we don't have a playground for our children. What can we do about it? And they put together their minds and try to come up with a solution. And then they go out and contact authorities to find an empty lot which can be turned into a playground for children by the municipality. This is what I'm talking about. Or they are concerned about the kind of traffic there is around the schools where their children attend. And they would like to ask the authorities to do something about it. Either place a traffic policeman or a woman, or build an underpass or overpass so that the children could go across dense traffic and what have you. And this is the sort of thing I want you to think about people debating. There are a huge number of issues, especially that pertain to municipal services. You know, the quality of the roads, whether they're paved or not, how they could be paved, the kind of garbage collection schedules which upset people or create traffic havocs, and they would like to ask the authorities to change the hours in which these are collected, and all of these may need more than a single petition or appeal and a communal kind of action. And you would ask the community to come together and discuss and debate these things. Some bizarre cases, of course, are reflected in the national media and the press. For example, a community of people have been coming together, discussing and trying to do some vigilante kind of activity to grapple with drug issues, for example, in certain parts of Istanbul. A recent upsurge of deaths due to consumption of a certain kind of drug had created a sensitivity among the people who have been getting together and debating among themselves and then trying to find solutions to it. Or somebody decides to build a skyscraper right next to a certain community, and these people do not want this kind of building to take place. They want to keep the place as green as before, and they try to get together and press it. And this is another issue which appears from time to time in the media. This is the kind of discussion I'm talking about. So this tends to go with campaigning in the Turkish case. All the way back to 1970s, these two do not seem to be differentiating, and they are separate from, they are linearly independent, as statistics terminology technically refer to them, as they are linearly independent of contacting and voting. So we have one dimension is voting participation, in conventional means through voting, contacting bureaucracy, appealing to the Grand National Assembly, governors, sub-district governor, mayor's office, etc. And then others that have to do with campaign rallies, etc., and also discussions of one sort or another, which load on this factor as factor analysis technical rhetoric goes. So these loadings are high, and we have three dimensions. Indeed, in 2014, we still have those three dimensions. Contacting, discussion, campaigning, and voting. Three-dimension emerges. Therefore, when you then ask the statistical package to compute factor scores per dimension, then you get an index of those who participate more or less in one of these dimensions. And if you can add them up, you can have an overall conventional participation score per individual case in the data set, which is a summation of the factor scores calculated on the basis of these loadings per individual case on contacting, discussion and campaigning and voting. And then we have a dependent variable which we can measure and estimate. Then protest behavior. Protest behavior, we ask such questions as have you ever taken part in petitioning, toplu dilekçe in Turkish? Or have you ever taken part in boycotts? Or legal demonstrations? Or not formally sanctioned strikes that are legitimate perhaps but not legal, not formal? Or occupation of a building or a workplace? Well, these are the responses given in 2002 to these questions, that they had never taken place in any of these acts. About 69% said that they've never taken part in petitioning. About 81% said that they did never take part in boycotts. 77% never participated in legal demonstrations. Then it jumps over 90% when the difficulty or costliness of the act becomes more pronounced, more conspicuous. These are now acts that are not necessarily legal, and the consequences could be grim for the individual. If an individual is arrested by the police, he or she may have not only a few nasty hours to spend in a police station, or be arrested for a longer period of time and be incarcerated, and may even stand up to a certain trial as a defendant, but his or her record in the police may also be tainted because of that, and that may be costly for those who may be young enough to seek jobs in life. Therefore, many tend not to participate in those sorts of things, and non-participation rate goes about 90% under those circumstances. And participation rate, again, drops tremendously. Those who said that they did participate is about 7% in the first case, close to 0% in the last case, as you can see, and sharply goes down. As non-participation rate goes up, participation rate goes down, as you would expect. And those who said that they may participate, again, follow a similar trajectory. On the left-hand side, where you have petitioning, which is an easy act, where the cost may not be that high, about 21% says, about 1 out of 5 voters, voting age population says, respondent says, yes, I may participate, as opposed to about almost 0, where we have, again, somewhere around 2.3% plus or minus sampling error, and therefore this is close to 0. Again, about 3% say that they may consider doing something of the sort. And that is about 1/7 of this. So sharply drops as the cost increases. As you very well know, as the cost or price of something increases, the demand for it drops. So as the cost increases here, less demand. In 2014, when we asked the same questions, non-participation rates have dropped somewhat, as you can see. We don't see any 90% on this list any longer, as you can see. In fact, occupation of building is still high, close to 90%, but it's not over 90%. It used to be 93%. Now it's down to 88%, 89%. Slight drop, but still non-participation is very high. But this time we added a question. Petitioning, boycotts, legal demonstrations, again, non-formal strikes, occupation of building, taking part in protests in meydan in Turkish, park, and sokak in Turkish. Try to understand whether anything happened that we missed earlier with, say, something like Gezi Park Institute. Incidents. Again, non-participation is relatively high, 80%. But it's no higher than the other two, as you can see, occupation of buildings or non-formal strikes, slightly higher than legal demonstrations, almost the same as participating in boycotts. Petitioning, again, is the lowest non-participation. But this time now about 12% say that they had taken part in writing down or signing petitions. Toplu dilekçe. And about 8% now, way above the sampling error, 8% has taken part in legal demonstrations. And the others are relatively low. But about 5% argue that they had taken part in such a demonstration. 5% corresponds to about roughly 3 million people. According to the official count of the Ministry of Interior Affairs, in the Gezi Park incident, in 79 out of 81 provinces in Turkey, about 2.6 million people participated in these events. Very close. We may be doing something right. Never know. It's a guesstimate after all. Again, when you factor analyze these, dimensions come out. And all of these load on one single factor. Therefore, this is the factor of protest potential in Turkey. Two such instances, one for 2002, one for 2014. All of these neatly fall on one single dimension, and therefore we can calculate factor scores with these loadings per individual participating in these studies. 1,984 individuals in one case, 1,666 in the other. And we have score per individual on protest potential in the data set, and we have another dependent variable. And then repression potential. In 2002, we asked these three questions. Takes part in breaking up legal demonstrations, takes part breaking up non-formal strikes, takes part in ousting those who occupy buildings, go in there and throw them out. Again, non-participation rates are relatively high because these are very costly acts. It almost requires physical brutal force. And being involved in physical brutal force endangers one's well-being. You can get hurt. Potentially, you can get killed. And those who argue that they may take place is close to zero in both of these two cases, but not so far as occupation of buildings are concerned. Have people taken place? Have they actually done it? Well, almost none of them said that they did. These are very, very low percentages, may be considered as zero. And don't know responses also a little over our sampling error at the time. In 2014, still non-participation rates are high. But we added two more questions to the original three. These are the original three. We added two more questions. Takes part in breaking up protests in squares, parks, streets. We had the famous Palalı incident, where a certain individual whose shop lost customers because of these demonstrations came out into the streets with something that looked like a sword in his hand, started chasing protesters, and eventually kicked a passerby, a lady, on the back. And he was arrested by the police, then released. He went to Morocco, married to a Moroccan lady, as I understand. Stayed there for a while, then came back, was rearrested, charged with a 27-year sentence. Then he was released from prison. His trial is still continuing, although media and the press pays no more attention to it, so we don't know what happened. This is the sort of act we're talking about, repressive act. So this is one action. Another is takes part in a rally, not in breaking up, but a rally to protest, criticize, react, a protest rally. So you have anti-government rally and those who are protesting the anti-government rally, most likely pro-government rally. So those two are added on to this picture. And as you can see, those who argue that they had taken place, they had participated, is again very low, but not as low as the 2002 incidents, which is practically zero. These are again very near zero, and this is higher than zero. So it looks as if about 3% with our sampling at around 2.6%, you know, a little less than perhaps in this data set of ours, about 16, 20 people said that they had participated in this kind of act. And the don't know responses have also stayed more or less the same and slightly increased in most occasions. But the important thing is that the may participate category has increased slightly for the latter case, and much more so, more than doubled for these two cases. It looks as if repression potential has increased in Turkey considerably. And the variance in these responses has also increased. Earlier, we couldn't find any variable explaining the kind of responses we had received, but now we do. And we do have two measures of repression potential, one for 2002 and one for 2014. In both cases, all the responses load on one single dimension neatly. And therefore, we can measure the two, although in the first case, we don't have these two cells. They are not applicable because we hadn't asked these questions, so it consisted of only 3 items. And now we have a more decent factor analytical measure of 5 items. And therefore, we seem to have a better measure of it. So, now that we have defined conventional participation, then unconventional participation, both as protest and repression, and measured them, hopefully, validly, we can then now start theorizing about how to make sense out of these responses. What explains those who participate in conventional acts from those who does not? What explains the motives and the reasons why those people who participate in the protest or repression potential, and why do others fail to do so? What is the difference? And what explains these differences? And we can next turn to that. Today, we'll take one more step and bring some theoretical understanding to political participation in the Turkish context, in which I have this beautiful theory of political participation. An action that is thought through by an individual so as to commit a certain behavior to produce a certain result by influencing those in position of authority is what we're trying to explain. To be able to account for this kind of action, we may argue that one needs to have, first of all, the opportunity to make an impact on the decision being made. If you don't know about it, if you do not have the necessary levers to pull, the connections to make, if you cannot be heard by these people who are in a position of making these decisions, then you will not be able to have the opportunity to make an impact. The laws, institutions, and culture provide the opportunity, or opportunities in plural, for an individual to act, to influence a political decision. Different political systems produce different opportunity structures for people to take action in. But if you have representative government, institutions of representation, a legislature, or elected officials, then elections, that would provide the individual with lots of opportunities. In the Turkish case, we do have both an elected legislature and elections in which popular participation takes place, and representatives are elected by the people, which provides wide array of opportunities for individuals to make an impact on those who are ruled. And also, individuals may use other facilities such as the social media, email, fax machines, write down letters, contact the officials through various means, and all of these means are provided for by the laws of the country, and therefore they provide large variety of opportunities for individual to exert a certain amount of pressure on the decision makers and influence these decision makers by first taking part in the election or selection of these individuals who serve as political authorities, as incumbents of various positions. They participate in the election of legislators. Legislators, once they're elected, from among themselves, they choose a council of ministers to occupy positions of the executive and also various positions in the legislature. Therefore, they are in a position to influence those who come to rule the country by participating in the elections. That provides a great opportunity. So you have to have opportunities. Unless you have the opportunity to make an impact, you cannot make an impact. One necessary condition is that you have to have opportunities. Second, you have to have resources. You have to have political resources to make an impact, which means you should be able to speak comprehensible language, for example. That's a resource. That the individual who would like to make an impact should be able to use the language with some kind of minimum standard effectiveness. It will help if this individual knows how to read and write. For most of these opportunities are provided in the form of electronic or hard copy letters, in writing, or to be able to use telephone, no numbers, etc., so that they can dial a telephone. Therefore, it helps if the individual is literate, or it helps even better if the individual, in case, is educated, can understand the language of the law, can make a contribution to it, can follow legal debates. And at the same time, it will help the individual a lot if the individual is in a position to follow the news, to understand the news, to decipher the news, and make calculations about the news. So all of these require some resources, such as education, age. In this country, political game is usually a game that men play. Therefore, being of the right gender also helps in certain circumstances. It helps if you belong to a certain community of people, either established along the basis of a territory or a religious establishment. Some kind of organizational resource is also helpful. Membership in unions or trade unions, etc., would help. So these are all potential resources. Now, you may have the resources, you may have the opportunity, but if you lack motives, you won't be able to participate. It is required that you have the motivation to do something. Motivation is basically a mental state which produces the mental state of preparedness, attitudes. If you have the attitudes that provides you with incentives for participation, motivates you to act in one direction or another, you will be able to participate in politics. Therefore, you will be able to seize the opportunity, employ your resources, and with your motives, get involved in the act of participation. And motives are usually your interest in politics, your understanding of how efficacious you are, how influential you think you would be if you take a certain step, whether you believe that the steps you take in participation will be costly or not, if you are to play a role of a participant and in the end pay a very high price, the higher the price, the less the demand. And therefore, if the price is very high, you will not be able to participate. You will be intimidated, threatened, or you will be demotivated to participate. The less the price, the more motivated you would be to participate. So if you feel efficacious, that you have a feeling that you can make an impact and change the way people think, or change the way they will act, or change the way they will decide, then you will be highly motivated to participate. Knowing about politics also produces some motives in participation as such. So with all these three conditions come together, when you find the opportunities presented to you by the system, you have the resources that you develop, such as education, living in an urban environment, being of the right age, to be taken seriously, above the age of 18, for example, and being of the right gender, etc. These are all resources that you can put to work, and you can only be able to size up the situation, make your calculations and move if you have the right kind of motives to take part in politics. Now, some, of course, are interested in politics and some are not. Not all are interested in politics. We know that a very little percentage of people are constantly interested in politics. A large majority of people are not so much interested in politics because there's so many things to do in life. Politics is one of them, probably not the most important one of them. And a lot of people will be interested in recreational activities in leisure, sports, dance, arts, poetry, many other stuff. Politics do not necessarily interest them, or do not interest them regularly, in essence. A very few percentage of people think about politics systematically and live by thinking about politics most of the time. And these percentages are terribly low, very close to zero. So these political motives are scant at best and may act up in cases where people could somehow relate governmental decisions, political decisions of authorities with their way of living and their life. Then they will get the motivation, first of all, to get interested, and then to make an impact on these decisions in favor of their own interests, or to reinforce or promote certain values under these circumstances. So opportunities, resources, and motives will be what I will look into. And this is one way of looking at them, for example. This beautiful, elegant representation of causal linkages between a variety of resources, which also include such things as length of education, etc., are basic determinants of other phenomena. I only show those arrows that are empirically proven to exist, and that they make an impact through these motives on political participation, usually through motives that they come into some kind of action. And the findings. Of course, first, a measurement of the motives. For the 2002 study, political participation study that I talked to you about, whether some person knows something. These are the loadings of factor analysis on this, on items that pertain to knowledge, then that pertain to interest, then that pertain to political efficacy. How much of an impact will your vote have on the outcome of the election? Can there be major problems that can be solved, etc., are the kinds of questions you will ask. Not a very developed or rigorous measure of efficacy, but those are the only questions we had asked at that time. So the findings are a set of simultaneous equations which estimate the contribution of each exogenous and endogenous variable in these causal models, which you don't need to focus on very much, for the year 2002, which indicates that especially the motives play a major role, such as political efficacy or political interest in this matter. Knowledge is also very important. And the other variables, such as X2, which is age, seems to matter a lot in explaining the motives of people participating in some kind of conventional forms of political participation. For 2014, we don't have any well-developed knowledge scale which we could use. There are a few questions on which people are not very knowledgeable. We ask people whether they know anything, for example, about Black Sea economic cooperation, which Turkey was instrumental in establishing about 30 years ago almost, or 25 years ago. And it looks as if only about 5% of the people said that they knew something about it. And that's too little a variance to contribute to something of this sort, and they don't scale independently as such and do not necessarily contribute to our measurement. So I dropped knowledge from this picture, measure only two forms of motives. One is political efficacy, which is measured much better through questions like, in Turkey, a simple citizen such as myself does not have the power to change political decisions to my benefit, for example. It is one efficacy question. Most often I feel as if my life is changed by others who control my life than myself. Turkey is run by a few elites who do not care for the people. I'm trying hard, but whatever I do not feel as if it makes any change in the desirable status I have. Government in Ankara has a lot to say, whatever happens in and around the place where I live. So these kinds of questions were about the kind of effectiveness one could have possibly on the outcomes of political influence that one may be involved in. These two questions are about partisan interest, so I call this partisan interest rather than political interest in general. And when you make the same kind of analysis, the outcome is relatively different. Political efficacy makes a negative impact, not very much. Political interest is little influential. Religiosity makes a big impact, but a negative one. The more religious you are, less likely you are to participate in conventional political participation and the like. And these results do not seem to indicate that we can explain much in this analysis under these circumstances, but only about 10% of the variance in this case. Now, when we compare these results with an earlier finding in 1974, which I haven't mentioned here, with the results of 2002 and 2014 analysis on conventional political participation, we do observe that gender seem to have emerged as a major variable explaining conventional participation. It's a man's world in 1974, also 40 years later in 2014. But in between 2002, we found very little evidence pointing in that direction. Age, again, age seemed to have had some impact in the past. Older you get, the more interested in participating one becomes, but not so much currently. Age doesn't seem to be playing much of a role. Residence is the most important variable, which worked in the very same way throughout. As residential environment increased in where people lived, the less they participated in politics. Rural participation seemed to be more important than urban participation. And this is usually explained by something called decline of the community model, suggested by Almond Verba, Norman Nye, and Jaeon Kim in a study in the United States and other countries in 1978, where they argue that urban environment creates new circumstances for individuals who come especially from rural backgrounds. They find little solidarity and little roots in the new environments that they are in. Their life is much more mobile. They do not necessarily embed themselves in the communities they live in the urban environments, and they don't value them as much. And they find little incentive in participation under those circumstances to uphold the values of these communities in which they live. Therefore, urban environment creates a decline of community, a sense of decline where community is less and less perceived. Individualism increases, even egoism increases, where individuals become self-centered and they see little reason why they should take part in a ceremonial act as participating in elections, etc. So election participation rates drop as the metropolitan areas get larger. And therefore, in rural areas, more people tend to participate. The more urban the area becomes, all the way to metropolitan, less the participation. And this impact seems to have been similar over the years. Same percentage, negative, indicating that the more urban it becomes, the less people are to participate. Satisfaction with life has had very little impact, usually negative, in fact. Formal education, again, didn't seem to explain much under these circumstances directly. Socioeconomic status also didn't seem to make any major impact. Mass media exposure didn't have any direct influence on conventional political participation either. Trade union membership played very little role or no role now, but organizational membership in general, which had been measured in 2002 but not now, seemed to have made a big impact on political participation. It looks as if in 1974, more people were organized and mobilized by organizations to participate, and there were more ability of such organizations as trade unions to take part. As I had shown you that the impact of trade unions has become less now in Turkish politics, and they play less of a role in the lives of workers, let alone the larger society, and their impact on mobilizing people to participate is totally ignorable. You may simply ignore them. Do not exist. Political knowledge, not measured in these both occasions, seemed to have played some role. Efficacy seemed to have played some role. Political interest also had played some role, but the measure we employed, partisan interest, did not seem to have any role indicating here. And religiosity seemed to have increased its role in participation. So the more secular people became, the more they participated. And those who became more religious tended to stay away from participation, so it looked under these circumstances. So it's a matter of men, rural, small town phenomenon with a relatively upper class, work experience, and better employed, relatively more employed people, with secular credentials and not necessarily feeling very efficacious, tend to participate through conventional channels of political participation in 2014 as opposed to 1974. Now, so far as protest potential is concerned, over the years from 1990 through 1997 through 2002 through 2014, in this period of about 24 years, when we look at a series of variables that have to do with both resources and motivation, we observe that in this case, when you take these variables into consideration alone, gender still mattered. But only in 2002, women seem to be more interested in participating than men in protest, in various forms of protests. But from 1990 up until now, protest participation is again mainly a male phenomenon. Age did not matter much in protest potential. Residence indeed did not matter up until 2014, but 2014 protest potential became something that had to do with urban living, more of a part of urban life. Secular education played some role most of the time, an increasing role now in 2014. Political efficacy did not matter very much, but political interest, now measured as partisan interest, played considerable amount of role in participation in protests. Religiosity, which had been documented as a factor inhibiting protest participation, those who are more religious tended not to participate in protest movements in Turkey in the 1990s, also early 2000s. Now religion does not seem to explain anything, so far as protest potential is concerned. Overall explanation capacity of these variables measured by multiple regression seems to have also gone down slightly, not dramatically. Therefore, they still tend to explain some. But protest potential seems to have been changing from a phenomenon that was more or less unrelated with residential settings in which the individuals lived to a more urban phenomenon, more influenced by education. The more educated one is, the more one is likely to take part in protests. Had a lot to do with especially partisan interests, and also a male phenomenon increasingly in the Turkish context, especially in the recent years. When you compare the levels of participation in Turkey with a set of countries from the European Union, also in Latin America, as well as Asia, we observe in this measure that the overall rates for protest potential, so far as petitioning is concerned, is highest in Britain, according to the findings of World Values Survey, where 74.5%, 3/4 of the population, seem to have argued that they have taken part. Those who recall participating, they have taken part in petitioning, 3/4. Turkey, this has been relatively low, as you can see. In 1997, it was the highest for the Turkish results, 13.5%, compared to 74.5%. It's about 1/5 of it. In 2014, it's about 12%. Again, very, very humble by the protest potential standards of Europe, where the percentages only drop in Spain to this level in the 1990s. These are 1990 percentages. Boycotts, highest in Iceland, and Turkish levels had increased to about 6.3% in 1997. It's now dropped slightly, dropped in 2002 and regained some ground, about 5%, but these are very small percentages, and compare similarly with, say, Portugal in the stable, or Spain, Southern Europe. In Northern Europe, it looks as if there is more proclivity for taking part in boycotts. These are actually people arguing that they had taken part in boycotts. Legal demonstrations, Again, in this list, the highest is this time Italy. 34% argue that they had taken part in legal demonstrations. France is a close second with 32%, 31% arguing that they had taken part in legal demonstrations. And these percentages in Turkey are way low, way below the European, or for that matter, Indian percentage, for example. It has now climbed a little bit to about 7.6%, but it is still 1/3 of the level of Spain, let's say, and 1/5 of the level of legal demonstration participation in Italy or France, for that matter. So very, very little in comparison. Non-formal strikes, Denmark tops the list with 16.7% of people saying that they had taken part in non-formal, not formally recognized strikes. So they may be illegal or illegal at best. So 17%, almost 1 out of 5 people participating in such strikes in Denmark, which is the highest in this list, also very high by European standard, followed by Britain with about 10%. And the Turkish case, it recently increased to about 3%, again with about 2.6%, sampling error very close to zero, and nothing much. But previously, it was again much lower in Turkey than 3%, about 1.4 to 1.2%. So always very close to zero. And that, therefore, does not seem to indicate that Turkey is high on non-formal strikes either. Occupation of buildings, again, that has increased in Turkey in recent years. It had gone down to about 0.5% in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It's now up to about 2 percentage points, similar to US, for example, or a little below the Spanish, but above the Portuguese performance. In that case, France tops the list with about 7% of the people arguing that they had actually participated in occupying a building. That's a relatively large proportion by those standards. And it's closely followed by Italy this time, 7%. And that's not a very significant difference. Those two countries seem to have the greatest amount of protest potential so far as building occupations are concerned, which is again more than 3 times Turkish levels. On the basis of this, you can argue that protest potential is great in Turkey, especially in comparison to Europe or even to India. It is very high or very threatening. Indeed, you can say the opposite. Protest potential is relatively low in Turkey and stays low in Turkey. So on that basis, when there was a bout of protestation occurring about a year and a half ago, in the Taksim Square of Istanbul near a park, almost all of us were surprised to see this kind of sudden upwardly trend for protestation, which looked not very much in line with the kind of picture we observe here. Of course, those who participated in such acts, we can learn more about it as we go down the list. But if we look at the explanatory factors explaining this kind of performance in Turkey between 1990 and 2014, and also in France, Britain, US, Germany, the Netherlands, again, UK, USA, Germany, and Austria, from studies conducted by Marsh and Kase earlier on, it looks as if similar variables seem to be explaining similar percentages. For example, when you compare the R's, 0.58, 0.50, 56, 0.50, in the Turkish case it's 0.41, 0.50, 39, 36. Not too different. If you go down this line, it's again 0.39, 41, 48, 42. In the Turkish case, 47, 49, 35, not too different than this. 35, also not too different from what is explained in Austria by all of these variables, where you have resources mainly, and some satisfaction-related variables included in the picture. It looks as if in the recent times, in 2014, it looks as if some of the factors, such as age, now fail to explain much in the Turkish case. Again, it's mainly a male phenomenon. Education among these variables, when you enter them into this equation, explains some protest potential. Strength of party identification is not very influential. Political efficacy, again, is not very influential, but policy dissatisfaction seems to be working to contribute to protest behavior in the Turkish case, as it had done in the past. So, under these circumstances, the kinds of explanations made for Europe are not too different in the Turkish case when you compare the results with the results that you get from these 4 countries in this 4-country European study of earlier times. Now, the more recent times, again, the picture shows something relatively similar. It looks as if religiosity is of some capacity to explain what is going on. Alevism is negatively related with this phenomenon. It looks as if Alevis are less inclined to protest, whereas political Islamism and Sunniism is more inclined to protestation, but only slightly, not a great explanation. Education plays a major role, as more educated tend to participate in protestations. It's again a male phenomenon, basically. And trade unionism membership, which is right now is very, very small in number, does not seem to have much of an explanation. Occupational prestige also does not seem to explain much. In the Netherlands, for example, 0.1, Germany 0.1, Turkey 0.6, but statistically not significant. So under these circumstances, similar factors seem to be at play. Although in some cases these variables such as age is not significant in Turkey, when it is significant, it's in the same direction, negative, which indicates that in all these countries, protest behavior is the behavior conducted by young. The more aged you are, the less inclined to protest, participate in protests you are. In Western Europe, in most of these countries, all the way until late 1990s, this was considered to be a female phenomenon. Now it's a mainly male phenomenon in Turkey, that more men tend to participate in protestation and are inclined to participate in protestation than women in the Turkish case. Education played a similar role in all of these countries, and religiosity positively enhanced protestation and protest participation in Europe, whether the countries are overwhelmingly Protestant or otherwise. Religiousness seemed to have a positive impact. In Austria, as well as Germany, in both countries, with different religious numbers, in Catholicism and Protestantism, etc., the impact seems to be similar, whereas religiosity overall is negative in Turkey. And there's a big difference between the two. The religiously oriented are not very much inclined to participate in protests, especially the Alevis seem to be of this nature, which seems to indicate that those you find involved in protesting certain phenomena among Alevis from time to time are not doing this out of an act of potential influence because of efficaciousness, but mostly because of desperation, that their backs are on the wall, there's nothing else that they can do, and they seem to be acting in desperation against the authorities and trying to influence them by screaming out of threat, probably, not necessarily out of potential influence. And of course, the elite cultures in these countries and Turkey are diametrically opposite. The elites in Europe are much more favorable towards peaceful protests, as Turkish elites are towards peaceful protests in Turkey. And in fact, peaceful protests are not necessarily welcomed in this country, and as much effort as possible is being rendered to convert them into non-peaceful protests, as we have observed in Gezi incidents. It looked as if for a while political authorities even cherished the idea that some violent actors could get into the action and play a major role in these moves of something which had started as a peaceful protest movement in the Gezi Park incidents in Istanbul in May and June 2013, so that they could ask these other people who are not involved in violence and who detest violence to vacate the premises so that the police can fight it out with the ones who are violent, which is what they see as a more manageable affair in the Turkish case. And it looked as if the authorities were eager to consider this as an act that involved violence so that they could legitimately use excessive amount of police force to somehow suppress all kind of opposition to government policy, which is not the regular and usual attitude that we observe in Europe after the Second World War, especially after the 1960s, where the elite political culture seemed to have changed in Europe in the direction of accepting non-materialist form of policy making and participation as quote-unquote normal way of life. And therefore, peaceful participation is accepted as legitimate and legal in the eyes of the political authorities, and they do not necessarily react to it by using excessive amount of police force. That is the big difference between the two performances, which are not reflected in these statistics, but which is something that you can easily observe in the Turkish case as opposed to the European cases. For example, so far as these Gezi Park incidents are concerned in 2013, a fan group from Beşiktaş Gymnastics Club, as it's called, BJK, Beşiktaş Gymnastik Kulübü. It's a sports club, and they have a very active and vocal fan group called Çarşı. And they were pressed charges that they were involved in an act of coup, and they were trying to oust the government and topple the government by force. Now, of course, this is hard to fathom, simply because the government is in Ankara, central government, and this group is in Istanbul. Even if they captured everything that the government owned in Istanbul and turned it over, you can't turn over the government unless and until you get to Ankara. So that, of course, is the first problematic part of this argument. But secondly, this was a group that had not been initially involved in any kind of active political protestation when events started to unfold. It looks as if the main reason why this group was targeted was because they became active after the 30th of May incidents because of the kind of treatment that the police had given to them about 3 weeks earlier. In the beginning of May, on the 11th, Beşiktaş Sports Club had a soccer match in a stadium nearby, which is under construction. If you have visited that part of Istanbul, Vodafone is building a new arena for Beşiktaş Sports Club near the Dolmabahçe Palace. And I'm sure you have seen the construction site. It was that stadium that they were going to go to. And this was at Beşiktaş, where there are these boats that travel back and forth with the Üsküdar from one side of the Bosphorus to the other. And I'm sure some of you have visited Beşiktaş. So the Çarşı group was in the middle of this mall of Beşiktaş, which is right opposite from the square on the other side of the road that is near the port facility at Beşiktaş. And they were having a good time, as fans do. They were singing, and they were chanting, and they were drinking beer. According to the Turkish press, the Prime Minister went by the place and told the police why they were permitting these people to drink beer so near his office in Istanbul, which is in the Dolmabahçe Palace. And Çarşı is actually almost next to the Dolmabahçe Palace, this location where they were having this kind of fun. So the police contacted them and told them to stop rejoicing about the match, stop all their activities, and stop drinking. As fans anywhere and everywhere, they did not heed the call of the police. Then they were attacked by police with excessive force. They used huge amount of pepper gas on these people, and not only them, but all sorts of people living around that area were almost put in a gas chamber by the police. And there were some who were hurt by all of this, some almost failed to breathe, etc. And the police and these fans became enemies as of that day. And they started to yell against the Prime Minister, which is what fans could do under normal circumstances. Certain slogans and opposition, asking for his resignation, etc., on that day, on that occasion, but their activities were suppressed. When the events flared up at the end of May, beginning of June, they participated in the protests against the government in that kind of mood, which had been flared up a couple of weeks ago from May 11 incidents, when the police used a similarly heavy-handed tactic against these people, several ecologists who were camping at Taksim Square, to evict them from the park. They burnt their tents, they gassed them, and these people, in sympathy, participated in Taksim. Police tried to stop them. They got into a fight with the police around Beşiktaş. Allegedly, some of them attacked the offices of the Prime Minister, which is considered to be a coup. That's the interpretation of the Prime Minister, and lo and behold, coincidentally, the interpretation of the public prosecutor as well. And this court case is still continuing. And last week, as the trial is going on, the judge asked them whether they were involved in any kind of coup against the government. And their response was also very telling. He said, look, if we had the capacity, the resources and the opportunities to make a coup, we would first make Beşiktaş the champions. They weren't able to do so, as you can easily guess. So a fan club that cannot even make their club the champions could not have foreseen ousting the government from power by use of sheer force. That didn't look very reasonable as an argument goes. So under these circumstances, as you can see, there are a variety of phenomena which organized activity of one sort or another might have played in protest participation in Turkey, but that organization is not necessarily a trade union. for trade unions are no longer what they used to be. As I've told you earlier, only about 8 to 9% of the labor in Turkey are organized into trade unions, and these trade unions are not necessarily strong organizations any longer. They're very small in size. There are 115 of them, sharing among themselves 8.9% of the labor force as members, and they fail to make an impact. And the results here also show that as much as possible. Now, so far as repression potential is concerned, in 2002 study, we weren't able to find any sensible explanations for it. 2014, we asked several other questions, and that has enabled us to get a grasp, a better ground to explain the role of repression potential, why repression potential existed in the way it did. Let me remind you of that, the measure of repression potential. These are the measures that we used. So using 2014 results, taking part in protests, etc., and taking part in breaking up protests, getting people out of buildings that they occupied, and organizing rallies to protest the protesters. It's a sort of an anti-protest action. All of these were used to construct this repression potential in Turkey, and those who said that they did participate in such acts are relatively low, as you can see. There has been a little bit of an increase from about close to 0 to close to about 2 and 3. So it looks as protest potentials increased a little bit, so did repression potential in the country as well, which is not good news, because that also indicates that there is an increasing potential for clashes between these two groups of people. And hopefully we haven't lived through many of them yet, but in October, especially in the eastern and southeastern part of the country, something of similar nature occurred, where several deaths took place, and the government was shocked to observe this kind of development happening in an incident where international politics also came to play, where the Turkish government's policies towards a Kurdish settlement on the border between Turkey and Syria, on the Syrian side, Kobani, led to massive protestations and the encouragement of the Kurdish nationalist political leaders for protesters to register their disapproval of this policy, led to massive demonstrations and massive counter demonstrations where there seemed to be clashes between large numbers of people, and guns were wielded, and many died because of these clashes. And I'm not so sure we know the benign public outside the region know enough of what happened under those circumstances. So the potential for such clashes are there. But if you look at the findings, it indicates that age doesn't explain it. Male participation is probably somewhat important. Education is to a certain extent important. Probably some education is important. Not linear in the sense that, you know, with education, repression potential drops rather fast. So low education, high education, repression potential, high, low. So it's something like this probably. Not linear, but somewhat curvilinear, sharply dropping off with increased education. We don't see many postgraduates, PhDs, or university students involved in skull bashing of protesters, of others. And we're hoping that through college education, one learns enough to debate matters by dialogue, conversation, and deliberation, rather than by fist fighting instead. So there is a little bit of evidence indicated in that direction, but nothing great. All kinds of religious potential is negatively related to it. For the Alevis as well as Sunnis, neither seem to be too eager to take part in that. In fact, religiosity seems to be depressing it, demotivating people from getting involved in repressive activism, which is good. Again, trade union membership doesn't seem to explain much. Work experience does explain a little bit, which seems to indicate that some people who are employed are more eager to be involved in these kinds of repressive experiences, which explains perhaps the Palavra incident, as I told you yesterday about. This guy with a sword that came out, walked around and gestured as if he were attacking some passers-by and eventually kicked a lady on the back. So, and he was eventually caught, etc. So he was presented to us as an artisan, someone with a shopkeeper whose shop was influenced by all of these things that took place under these circumstances. So in essence, we have less capability explaining this kind of repression potential, but it looks as if political efficacy is negatively related to it, which seems to indicate that those who feel efficacious tend not to be involved in this kind of activity, but probably more conventional forms of activity, not repressive kind of activity. And those who have policy satisfaction, which means they consider the economic situation beneficial, tend to be involved in this kind of repressive activity. So this, to a certain extent, perhaps explains the kind of involvement of some shopkeepers during the Gezi incidents in various parts of the country, in Eskişehir, Hatay, Istanbul, elsewhere, where they were involved in capturing some of these protesters and beating the hell out of them and killing some of them. So under these circumstances, it looks as if these two, policy satisfaction and employment working together leads to some kind of class action by these artisanal groups, these shopkeepers, etc., to repress protesters. For they believe that life is good for them and these protesters are threatening their interests under these circumstances. There may be some explanation for it under these, on the basis of these findings that we have. But essentially, we don't have as good an explanatory power coming out of these variables as we had, for example, with these. Look at the multiple correlation coefficients here. They're above 0.35, 0.41, 0.50, 0.39, 0.36, 0.35, 35, 49, 47. What we have here is 0.22 and 0.20. They explain about meager 4% of the variance and 5% of the variance here, whereas these explain more than 10% of the variance, which seem to be more in line with the findings abroad, although in a different culture. So it looks as if we still have to come up with a better explanation for repression potential, though variance there is even much more slight than protest potential. At least in protest potential, we do have those who argue that they participated close to double digits. In this case, we have very close to zero. And therefore, the potential here seems to be much less than it is with protest potential. And therefore, repression potentials, since the variance is very small, explaining that variance becomes increasingly difficult and complicated phenomenon. And therefore, we can't argue that we have done something great in explaining all of this. So in essence, I can conclude that As the opportunity structure increased, resources also increased with urbanization. Potential for participation in protests and repressive acts also increased in Turkey to a great extent. And we have observed an upsurge for protest behavior, especially as conventional forms of participation do not seem to bring about the kind of outcomes that a large number of voters perceived beneficial to them do not exist. Mind you that the political party that gets the most votes receives approximately somewhere around 35 to 40% of the registered voters, all registered voters in the country. But since the participation rate is lower than all registered voters, and it oscillates between lower 70s and lower 90s in percentage, the ratio of that number of votes changes dramatically from election to election. But that still leaves a relatively large majority of 63 to 65% of the people who had not voted for the government, political party, or the candidate or candidates of the governing party. And following a strategy of majoritarianism, downgrading the role of opposition, in fact stigmatizing it, even delegitimizing it and demonizing it from time to time, large swaths of the population become alienated from the government. And they look for alternative ways of presenting their complaints, needs, and expectations through protestation. In response to this, the government in recent times have been taking one draconian measure after another and rendering any kind of peaceful protest as totally out of context as an illegitimate act of military sponsored or foreign sponsored or enemy sponsored seditious act of some sort or a coup of some sort, illegitimate in essence. And therefore, increasing the stakes of taking part in these kinds of activities. Therefore, we should expect in the short run, because of the cost of being involved in protest participation increases so much, and the government seems to be in recent times giving more support to repressive action. And most recently, the president also made a declaration that the esnaf in Turkey, the artisans, are also the police, insinuating that they have the right to interfere with protesters by wielding clubs, sticks, and hit them and kill them, in essence. Just the kind of thing we observed during the Gezi Park incidents. It looks as if he seemed to be approving of this kind of thuggery, in essence. Increases the chances of repressive action, which may be tolerated more by the authorities, as opposed to protest behavior, which seem to be getting short shrift. And there is increasing amount of effort at defining any kind of peaceful protest as a potentially threatening, violent act, and pressing charges for people who are committed in this kind of act, who are involved in this kind of act. So you can predict that the cost of being involved in even the most peaceful kind of protest act is very, very high now in Turkey, whereas repressive action is getting less and less costly. So you can expect more repressive acts in the future, less protest participation under these circumstances, which are not part of these variables but tells you something about the opportunity structure. Therefore, the opportunity structure of Turkey is now providing a much narrow opportunity, much narrow maneuverability for those involved in protest behavior, larger maneuverability for those involved in repressive action, and also more tolerance for conventional kinds of political participation, especially in the type of voting. The voting has now become almost sacrosanct, an act which defines almost anything and everything about democracy in Turkey. And that led to the very conversion of Turkish democracy to a form of what Terry Carl of Stanford University called electoralism. And we in this country called sandıksal democracy. It's all right to vote, especially if you're voting for the government party. But it's not necessarily all right to participate in the activities of the opposition parties, as they are also coming under increasing amount of pressure not to propagate against the government. We have seen some alarming incidents on the 17th of December, which is an anniversary of a big revelation on political corruption of the current government party and the president of the country, which the opposition tried to bring up to the attention of the people and set the agenda. But the opposition was not permitted to brandish the posters, placards, and the related material, even hoist them on their own buildings, as the police interfered on grounds that are unknown to us, remove these posters from when they were put up by the opposition. Opposition's meeting places were cancelled by intervention from Ankara, according to the opposition. And therefore they could not carry through their own activities of opposition to the government under these circumstances. And that is again a major erosion of credentials of democratic government under these circumstances. So life is becoming more tough for the opposition as well under these circumstances. Therefore, even legal demonstrations, rallies, meetings by the opposition is having difficulty of being organized and run under these circumstances. So consequently, it becomes ever more difficult for any kind of protest to occur without those who are involved in it, if caught, being pressed with draconian charges and could actually pay a very punishing price for even the most peaceful acts of participation, which should, in a democratic environment, be considered as legitimate, acceptable, and encouraged, not discouraged by the government under these circumstances. So even most forms of conventional participation, such as participation in rallies of the opposition, participation in campaigning of the opposition, etc., will be curtailed. And therefore we will see less participation in Turkey by the opposition. And that is likely to create even greater demands for increasing democratization in this country, and that will be creating greater demands for freedom of expression, and freedom of organization, association, freedom of the press and media to come. So you will continue on hearing those as well. And you will probably hear a lot more about various court cases appearing in Turkey on pressing charges against protesters on terribly flimsy grounds and creating widespread feeling of lack of justice being implemented under these circumstances. So the country seems to be moving in a direction of more confrontation, but at a higher price, as we observe under these circumstances in our analyses, as you can see.